There is a unique kind of isolation that comes with exploring the deep wilderness during the early transition from winter to spring. The air retains a sharp, biting chill. The ground is often damp with melting frost, and the usual hum of insects and birds is noticeably absent. It was during this quiet season, exactly 2 years ago, that I decided to take my dog, Duke, on a multi-day camping trip. Duke was a young blue heeler, a breed known for its immense intelligence, high energy, and intense loyalty. Because he was still in the middle of his training phase, I always made a conscious effort to avoid the more popular, heavily trafficked state parks. When a high-energy dog like Duke is learning how to behave on a trail, the presence of other hikers, children, and unfamiliar pets can create too many distractions, making the training process almost impossible. To solve this problem, I spent hours searching through obscure online forums and satellite maps to find trails that were completely off the beaten path. The trail I selected for this specific trip was a hidden gem, or so I thought at the time. It was an unmarked, non-active path that didn't have a single review on any of the common hiking applications or camping websites. It was located in a densely forested region, far away from any major highways or towns. For a trainer looking for absolute solitude, it felt like the ultimate destination. When we arrived at the makeshift trailhead, the weather was clear but cold. Duke was practically bursting with excitement, his muscles tense with anticipation as I fastened his gear. The initial hike into the forest took about 2 hours of steady, uphill walking. The path was overgrown, covered in fallen branches and thick layers of decaying pine needles, proving that no one had maintained this trail in a very long time. The deeper we marched into the timber, the more the outside world seemed to fade away. The silence of the forest was heavy, broken only by the steady rhythm of our footsteps and the rustling of Duke moving through the brush beside me. Duke did exceptionally well during this phase. He stayed close to my side, responded perfectly to my commands, and demonstrated the kind of focus I had been working so hard to instill in him. By the time we reached a suitable clearing to pitch our tent, the sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, geometric shadows across the forest floor. The campsite was incredibly isolated, surrounded on all sides by towering pine trees and dense thickets of thorn bushes. It felt as though we were the only 2 living creatures left on the planet. I spent the remaining daylight setting up the tent, organizing our supplies, and preparing a simple meal. Despite his long hike, Duke still possessed an abundance of residual energy, packing around the perimeter of the clearing and exploring the edge of the woods. I, on the other hand, was thoroughly exhausted from the physical exertion of the day. As darkness fully enveloped the forest and the temperature began to plummet, I crawled inside the heavy nylon tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and instructed Duke to come inside with me. He settled down at my feet, and within minutes I closed my eyes, expecting a peaceful night of rest. However, sleep did not come easily. Approximately 3 hours after the sun had fully set, when the forest was wrapped in total pitch-black darkness, I was abruptly awakened. It wasn't a sound that woke me, but rather a sudden movement at the foot of my sleeping bag. Duke had shifted his position. He was no longer lying down in a relaxed posture. Instead, he had risen to all 4 paws and was sitting completely upright, staring intently at the thin fabric wall of the tent. I reached out a hand to soothe him, but as soon as my fingers touched his fur, I felt how rigid his entire body had become. Every single muscle in his frame was locked tight, vibrating with an intense, underlying tension. This was entirely uncharacteristic behavior for him. Normally, after a long day of physical activity, Duke would sleep soundly through the night, indifferent to the standard ambient noises of the wilderness. But tonight, he was radiating a profound sense of anxiety. He began to pace back and forth within the confined space of the tent, his movements frantic and restless. He kept pressing his nose against the zipper of the tent door, looking back at me with wide, unblinking eyes. It was obvious that he desperately wanted to go outside. Thinking that the long hike and the heavy amount of water he had consumed before bed had caught up with him, I assumed he simply needed to relieve himself. I reached for my heavy winter jacket, pulled on my boots without tying the laces, and unzipped the front flap of the tent. The cold night air immediately rushed inside, causing me to shiver. I stepped out into the clearing, expecting Duke to quickly run to a nearby tree and do his business so we could return to the warmth of our sleeping bags. But Duke did not do that. The moment his paws hit the dirt outside the tent, his behavior transformed into something I had never witnessed before. He didn't wander off to explore or find a spot to relieve himself. Instead, he began to walk in slow, deliberate circles around the exact perimeter of our camp. His head was held low to the ground, his ears were pinned tightly against his skull, and his posture was defensive. Every few seconds, he would stop completely, locking his gaze onto a specific section of the dark tree line, standing like a stone statue as if he were guarding the area from an impending threat. A heavy, suffocating dread began to pool in the center of my chest. Kutin ki pas AC senses hodi hain jo insanan ki pas nahai hoten, or Duke Kai is extreme alertness ni muj andartak dara dia tha. I grabbed my powerful tactical flashlight from my jacket pocket and clicked it on, sweeping the bright white beam of light across the dense foliage that surrounded our campsite. I carefully scanned the gaps between the pine trees, looking for the telltale glint of animal eyes reflecting in the light, or the silhouette of a large predator like a bear or a mountain lion. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the pale trunks of the trees and the tangled branches, but revealed absolutely nothing. The forest appeared entirely empty. There were no rustling leaves, no snapped twigs, and no visible movements. Despite the lack of visual evidence, Duke refused to relax. He continued his rhythmic patrol of the campsite, his eyes constantly darting toward the dark void beyond the reach of my flashlight. I stayed outside in the freezing cold with him for over 30 minutes, repeatedly sweeping the light across the perimeter, but the woods remained stubbornly silent. The biting wind was starting to numb my fingers, and my lack of sleep was making me irritable. I began to rationalize the situation, telling myself that Duke was probably just unnerved by the unfamiliar sounds of a nocturnal animal, like an owl or a small opossum, that his young mind hadn't encountered before. Desperate to get back into the tent and escape the cold, I firmly grabbed his collar and guided him back through the nylon doorway, zipping the entrance shut behind us. Once inside, I kept my flashlight close to my hand. Duke refused to lay back down at the foot of the bed. He remained standing, his body still tense, positioned directly between me and the tent door. He was acting as a physical barrier, a silent protector standing guard in the dark. I lay there in the dark, my eyes wide open, listening to the absolute silence of the wilderness. The hours began to tick away with agonizing slowness, and just as my eyelids were beginning to feel heavy with exhaustion, Duke's body went completely rigid once again. This time, I felt the shift instantly. He leaned forward, pressing his head directly against the fabric of the tent door. The air in the tent felt freezing, and a terrible realization washed over me. Duke wasn't reacting to a small animal or a random forest noise. Whatever was outside had just moved closer to our tent, and it was standing right on the edge of our clearing, completely hidden by the blackness of the night. The freezing darkness outside the nylon walls felt heavier than ever, and my breath cast pale plumes of mist into the cramped tent. Duke remained completely rigid, his entire muscular frame acting as a physical shield between me and the zippered doorway. He didn't make a single sound, no warning, no reaction, just a profound, locked-in focus that told me whatever he sensed was now dangerously close. The complete lack of typical forest noises made the situation even more terrifying. There were no nocturnal birds, no rustling leaves from the wind, just a dead, suffocating silence. I sat up slowly, trying not to let the nylon fabric rustle, and reached for my hunting knife and the heavy tactical flashlight. My fingers were trembling from a mixture of cold and pure adrenaline. I watched Duke's ears twist slightly, tracking a movement that my human ears were completely incapable of detecting. Then, the silence was broken. It wasn't the heavy, crashing stride of a black bear or the chaotic scampering of a deer. It was the distinct, slow, and deliberate sound of 2 feet stepping onto the damp pine needles just outside our tent. Someone was walking around our clearing. The realization that a human being was tracking me in a completely unmarked, unreviewed section of the wilderness at 2 in the morning sent a wave of absolute horror down my spine. There was no reason for a legitimate hiker to be out here without a flashlight, moving silently around a stranger's camp. The footsteps circled the tent once, slow and measured, before stopping completely right outside the front flap. Through the thin, semi-translucent fabric, I could see the faint blockage of the ambient starlight. A tall, dark silhouette was standing less than 2 feet away from where I sat. I held my breath, clutching the knife so hard my knuckles turned white. I expected the person to speak, to yell, or to rip the zipper open, but nothing happened. The silhouette just stood there, completely motionless for what felt like an eternity. Duke didn't back down. He pressed his chest firmly against the doorway, matching the intruder's presence with his own silent defiance. The standoff lasted for several agonizing minutes until the silhouette finally shifted, and the slow, crunching footsteps began to recede back into the dense timber. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in that exact position until the first pale cracks of dawn began to illuminate the forest floor. The moment there was enough light to see, I packed up our gear with frantic speed, shoving everything into my backpack without care. I kept Duke on a tight leash, his eyes still scanning the dense trees with high alertness. We didn't stop for breakfast or water. We immediately hit the trail back toward the vehicle. The 2-hour hike back felt twice as long as the trek inward. Every shadow cast by the morning sun looked like a person waiting in ambush, and every snapping twig made me spin around with my knife raised. Duke stayed directly ahead of me, his natural herding instincts kicking into overdrive as he constantly checked behind us to ensure we weren't being followed. When the trailhead finally came into view, and I saw my car sitting safely in the dirt cutout, a massive weight lifted from my chest. We got inside, locked the doors instantly, and I drove away from that isolated forest without looking back. To this day, I have no idea who was outside my tent that night or what their intentions were. I never found any other cars parked along the access roads, meaning whoever it was had either walked a tremendous distance in the dark or had been living out in those deep woods long before I arrived. That trip completely changed the way I view the wilderness. I still train Duke, and we still go on hikes, but I never visit unmarked or completely abandoned trails anymore. The illusion of perfect solitude is a dangerous trap. I am incredibly grateful for Duke's loyalty and sharp senses, because without his early warnings and his brave stance at the door, I might have been completely blindsided by whatever was lurking in the dark. He wasn't just a pet learning how to walk on a trail that night. He was the only reason I made it back home alive.